The rain felt appropriate on the day we buried my mother. Dark clouds hung low, and the steady patter of raindrops on umbrellas provided a rhythm to our grief. I stood by her grave, watching as they lowered her casket into the ground, feeling as though a part of me was being buried with her. My mother, Eleanor, had been my anchor, my best friend, and now she was gone. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't devastated, but because I'd spent all my tears during the 3 months of her battle with pancreatic cancer. By the end, when she finally slipped away, it felt like both a tragedy and a mercy. No more pain for her. Just an endless void for me. See, it's time to go. My friend Jake placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. His voice was soft, barely audible over the rain. I nodded, still staring at the casket. Mom's favorite lilies lay scattered across the polished wood, drops of water sliding off their white petals. I turned away, finally, and that's when I saw her, Linda, my stepmother. She stood beneath a large black umbrella, her face a mask of appropriate sorrow. But her eyes, cold, calculating, told a different story. She'd been married to my father for 5 years before he died in a car accident, when I was 15. After that, she'd stayed in our lives, supposedly out of love for me and my mother. Now I wondered if there had been other reasons all along. Back at the house, my mother's house, the place above our family bakery where I'd grown up, people milled around with plates of food and murmured conversations. I moved through them like a ghost, accepting condolences with automatic responses. The bakery below had been closed for a week now, the longest it had ever been shut in 30 years of operation. "Sweetie, you should eat something." Mrs. Kaminsky, our longtime neighbor, pressed a plate into my hands. I looked down at the food without seeing it. "Thank you," I managed, setting it aside as soon as she turned away. I made my way to the kitchen, needing a moment alone, away from the sympathetic glances and awkward embraces. But Linda was there, leaning against the counter with a glass of my mother's expensive bourbon in her hand. "Ah, there you are, T." Her voice was smooth as honey, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "We need to talk about arrangements." "Arrangements?" I asked, reaching for a glass of water. My throat felt like sandpaper. Linda took a slow sip of bourbon, watching me over the rim of her glass. "Yes, arrangements. For the house, for the bakery." A smile curved her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "For your future." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "What do you mean? The bakery is mine. Mom left everything to me." Linda laughed, a soft, dangerous sound. "Oh, Chi, sweet, naive Chi." She set her glass down with a decisive click against the countertop. "That's what we need to discuss. You see, you have no legal right to any of this." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about? I'm her daughter." "Are you?" Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the counter toward me. "Open it." With trembling fingers, I took the envelope. Inside were documents, old, yellowed papers that I had never seen before. Adoption papers. My name was there, my birth date, but the signatures, something was wrong with the signatures. "These are forged," Linda explained casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Your adoption was never legal. Eleanor wasn't your real mother, and you have no claim to her estate." She smiled again, that cold, calculating smile. "I, on the other hand, as her legal sister-in-law, am her closest living relative." The room seemed to tilt around me. "That's not possible," I whispered. But even as I said it, doubts crept in. I had always known I was adopted. My mother had never hidden that from me. But she had assured me everything was legal, that I was hers in every way that mattered. "I've already spoken with my lawyer," Linda continued, retrieving the envelope and documents from my nerveless fingers. "You'll need to be out of here by the end of the week. I'm being generous giving you that much time." "You can't do this," I said, finding my voice. Anger began to replace shock. "This is my home. The bakery is my legacy." Linda's expression hardened. "You're nobody, see, not legally, not to Eleanor, not to this estate. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." She picked up her glass again, draining the last of the bourbon. "I'll have a suitcase delivered to your room. Pack only your personal belongings. Everything else stays." With that, she brushed past me, her expensive perfume lingering in the air like a toxic cloud. I stood frozen in the kitchen, trying to process what had just happened. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be. But what if it was? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, thanking people for coming, accepting their condolences with a wooden smile, all while Linda's words echoed in my head. "You're nobody. You have no claim." By evening, the house was empty except for Linda and me. She had taken over my mother's bedroom without asking, leaving me to retreat to my childhood room, which, thankfully, remained untouched. I sat on my bed, staring at the walls covered in photos and mementos of a life I had thought was securely mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "How are you holding up? Need me to come over?" I considered it for a moment, then typed back, "Not tonight. Tomorrow. Maybe. Need to process." I set the phone aside and noticed the suitcase Linda had promised, sitting ominously by my door. The sight of it broke something inside me. I started to cry, silently at first, then in great heaving sobs that racked my body. I buried my face in my pillow to muffle the sound, not wanting to give Linda the satisfaction of hearing my breakdown. When the tears finally subsided, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Something wasn't right. My mother had been meticulous about everything, especially legal matters. She wouldn't have left this loophole, wouldn't have left me vulnerable. And then it hit me. The letter. Mom had given me a letter 3 days before. She died, making me promise not to open it until after the funeral. "When everything settles," she had said, her voice weak but insistent. "When you're alone and can think clearly." I scrambled off the bed and went to my dresser, pulling open the top drawer where I had hidden the envelope beneath my socks. It was still there, my name written in my mother's elegant handwriting across the front. With trembling fingers, I tore it open and unfolded the pages inside. "My dearest Chi," the letter began, and just seeing her handwriting brought fresh tears to my eyes. I wiped them away impatiently and continued reading. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry to leave you alone. But you're stronger than you know, sweetheart. And there are things you need to understand now that I can't protect you anymore. First, know that you are my daughter in every way that matters. I chose you. I loved you. And I have never regretted a single moment of being your mother. But there are complications to your adoption that I've never told you about. Complications that Linda may try to use against you now that I'm not there to stop her. Linda has been manipulating documents for years, preparing for this moment. She wanted the bakery from the day your father introduced us, and when he died, her greed only grew. The adoption papers she will show you are indeed forged, but not in the way she claims. The real papers are in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 247. The key is taped to the back of the frame of our first photo together in the bakery. Get those papers, Sai. They prove everything was legal and above board. But there's more. Linda isn't just a greedy opportunist. She's dangerous. When you were born, there was an incident at Memorial Hospital. 2 babies were accidentally switched and sent home with the wrong families. One of those babies was you. The other was Linda's niece, Sarah. By the time the hospital discovered the mistake, Linda had convinced her brother and his wife to keep quiet, to keep the baby they had been given, you, rather than go through the trauma of a switch. My adoption of you was arranged through Linda, who presented herself as a private adoption facilitator. What she didn't tell anyone was that her real niece, the baby who should have gone home with her brother, died in the other family's care. A case of SIDS that devastated everyone involved. Linda has never forgiven herself, or me, or you. In her mind, somehow, you got to live while Sarah died. I didn't learn all of this until after your father died, when Linda started dropping hints, making threats. I've spent the last 10 years documenting everything, building a case against her. All of that evidence is in the safety deposit box, too. Be careful, my darling girl. Linda is desperate and dangerous. Don't confront her until you have everything. You need to expose her completely. Trust Jake. He knows some of this, enough to help you. And remember that you are loved. You are mine. No piece of paper, forged or otherwise, can change that. All my love, forever and always, Mom. I read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing clarity along with a deep, cold anger. Linda had been playing a long game, waiting for my mother to die so she could swoop in and take everything. But Mom had seen it coming. She had prepared. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made me quickly fold the letter and tuck it into my pocket. There was a sharp knock on my door, and then Linda's voice. I expect to see progress on your packing in the morning, C. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to speak without revealing what I now knew. Instead, I waited until her footsteps retreated down the hall and her bedroom door closed. Only then did I pull out my phone and text Jake. We need to talk. Early tomorrow. Meet me at Riverside Park, 7 a.m. His response came immediately. I'll be there. I spent the night alternating between rage and strategic planning. If what my mother had written was true, and I had no reason to doubt her, then Linda wasn't just after the bakery. She was seeking some twisted form of justice or revenge for a tragedy that had occurred over 25 years ago. And I was caught in the middle of it. By morning, I had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. I dressed quietly, listening, for any sounds from Linda's room. Nothing. She had always been a late sleeper, something my mother had commented on with disdain more than once. The world happens before noon, she would say, as she rose at 4 a.m. to start the day's baking. I crept downstairs to the bakery, which felt eerily silent without the usual sounds of mixers and ovens and my mother's humming. The walls were lined with photos of the bakery's history, my mother as a young woman on opening day, me as a child with flour on my nose, the 3 of us, Mom, Dad, and me, standing proudly in front of the newly renovated storefront. I went straight to the first photo, the one of Mom holding me as a baby in front of the original bakery sign. My fingers trembled as I took it off the wall and turned it over. There it was, just as she had promised. A small key taped to the back of the frame. I pried it loose and slipped it into my pocket, then rehung the photo. A wave of grief hit me as I looked at my mother's face, so young and hopeful in the picture. I'll make this right, Mom, I whispered. I promise. I left the house quietly, not wanting to alert Linda that I was going out. The morning air was cool and damp, the aftermath of yesterday's rain leaving everything smelling fresh and clean. A stark contrast to the ugly truths I was uncovering. Jake was already waiting when I arrived at the park, 2 coffee cups in hand. He looked as exhausted as I felt, dark circles under his eyes, his usually carefully styled hair disheveled. You look like hell, he said by way of greeting, handing me one of the coffees. Thanks. You're not exactly ready for a photo shoot yourself. I took a grateful sip of the coffee, black with 1 sugar, just as I liked it. We sat on a bench overlooking the river, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the water. For a moment, we were silent, both of us watching a pair of ducks glide by. So, Jake finally said, "What's going on?" I pulled out my mother's letter and handed it to him. "Read this." He took it, our fingers brushing in the exchange. Jake had been my best friend since high school, the one constant in my life besides my mother. We had tried dating briefly in college, but quickly realized we worked better as friends. Still, There had always been an undercurrent of something more, a possibility neither of us had been brave enough to explore again. I watched his face as he read, saw his expression shift from concern to shock to anger. When he reached the end, he looked up at me, his eyes blazing. "That manipulative bitch," he said, his voice low and hard. I always knew there was something off about her, but this... He waved the letter. "This is beyond anything I imagined." "I need to get to that safety deposit box," I said. "Today, if possible, before Linda realizes what I'm doing." Jake nodded, already thinking ahead. "The bank opens at 9. We can be there when they unlock the doors." He paused, frowning. "But won't you need some kind of documentation? Proof that you're authorized to access the box?" I hadn't thought of that. "I don't know. Maybe Mom arranged something?" "The letter doesn't say." "We'll figure it out," Jake said with more confidence than I felt. "Your mom wouldn't have set this up without making sure you could access it." He was right, of course. My mother had always been thorough. "Okay, so we go to the bank at 9. But what do I do about Linda in the meantime? She's expecting me to be packing, getting ready to leave." Jake considered this. "Let her think that's what you're doing. Buy yourself some time. Once we have the documents from the safety deposit box, we can decide how to confront her." I nodded, feeling a small measure of relief at having a concrete plan. "There's something else," I said, hesitating. "The letter mentions that you know some of this." "What did Mom tell you, Jake?" He looked away, suddenly very interested in his coffee cup. "She came to me about 6 months ago when she first got her diagnosis. She was worried about what would happen to you if she died. She told me about the adoption being facilitated by Linda and that there might be some questions about its legality." He met my eyes again. "She asked me to look into it quietly. I have a friend who works at the courthouse, and she helped me access some records. Your mom was right to be concerned. There are inconsistencies in the paperwork. Why didn't you tell me?" "She made me promise not to, not unless it became necessary. She didn't want you to worry while she was sick, and she was hoping," he trailed off, "that she would beat the cancer." I finished for him. "That she'd have time to handle it herself, yeah." Jake reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry, Sai. I wanted to tell you." I squeezed back, unable to be angry with him. He had been honoring my mother's wishes, trying to protect me just as she had been. "It's okay. You're telling me now, and you're helping me. That's what matters." We spent the next hour strategizing, going over possible scenarios and planning our next moves. By the time we parted ways, Jake to go home and change, me to return to the house and maintain the pretense of packing, I felt more in control than I had since my mother's diagnosis. As I approached the bakery, I noticed a sleek black car parked out front that I didn't recognize. A man in an expensive suit was just exiting the front door, shaking hands with Linda, who was wearing a tailored dress I had never seen before, her hair and makeup impeccable despite the early hour. The man handed her a folder, which she accepted, with a smile that made my blood run cold. I ducked behind a nearby tree, not wanting them to see me. From my hiding spot, I watched as they exchanged a few more words. Then the man got back into his car and drove away. Linda stood on the doorstep for a moment, looking down at the folder in her hands with a satisfied expression before going back inside. My heart pounded. That had to be her lawyer. They were moving faster than I had anticipated. I needed to act. Quickly. I waited a few minutes to make sure the coast was clear, then approached the house, trying to look casual in case Linda was watching from a window. Inside, I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the clink of a spoon against a teacup, the soft murmur of her voice as she spoke on the phone. I slipped past the kitchen doorway, catching a glimpse of her back as she stood by the window, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, everything's proceeding as planned," I heard her say. "The girl doesn't suspect a thing." I hurried upstairs to my room, closed the door quietly, and leaned against it, my heart racing. The girl doesn't suspect a thing. If only she knew. I pulled out my phone and texted Jake. Linda's lawyer was just here. Need to move fast. Meet you at the bank at 9. His response came quickly. Got it. Be careful. I looked around my room at the life I had accumulated over 25 years. Photos, books, clothes, mementos. According to Linda, none of the furniture or larger items belonged to me. Only my personal effects. I grabbed a few essential items, some clothes, my laptop, my mother's recipe book that she had given me on my 21st birthday, and the small jewelry box containing the few pieces she had passed down to me. I stuffed them into a backpack, not the suitcase Linda had provided. Let her think I was still debating what to pack. At 8:30, I made my move. I could hear Linda in the shower. The pipes in the old house always groaned when the upstairs bathroom was in use. I crept downstairs, left a note on the kitchen counter, saying I had gone out to clear my head, and slipped out the back door. Jake was waiting in his car a block away, engine running. Any problems? He asked as I slid into the passenger seat. No, but she's definitely up to something. Her lawyer was there, and she was talking about everything proceeding as planned. Jake's jaw tightened as he pulled away from the curb. We'll stop her, see. Your mom made sure of that. The bank was just opening when we arrived. The marble lobby was nearly empty, just a few early customers and tellers preparing for the day. We approached the customer service desk, where a woman, with a nameplate reading Margaret, greeted us with a professional smile. Good morning. How can I assist you today? I took a deep breath. I need to access a safety deposit box, number 247. It belonged to my mother, Eleanor Jenkins. She passed away recently. Margaret's expression softened with sympathy. I'm very sorry for your loss. To access a deceased person's safety deposit box, we'll need to see a death certificate and proof that you're authorized to access the contents. Are you the executor of the estate? My heart sank. I don't know. I have the key, but I don't have those documents with me. Margaret looked uncomfortable. I'm afraid I can't grant access without proper documentation. Bank policy. Jake stepped forward. What if her name is on the account, as a joint owner? Margaret hesitated. Well, in that case, she would have full access rights. Let me check the records. She turned to her computer and began typing. I held my breath, not daring to hope. Had my mother thought of this? Had she added my name? After what felt like an eternity, Margaret looked up. Ms. Jenkins, it appears that you are indeed listed as a joint owner of the safety deposit box. Your mother added you to the account last year. She smiled. I'll just need to see some identification, and then I can take you to access your box. Relief flooded through me. Once again, my mother had thought ahead, had protected me in the only way she could. I fumbled in my purse for my driver's license, handed it over with shaking hands. Margaret examined it, compared it to something on her screen, then nodded. Everything seems to be in order. If you'll follow me, please. She led us through a security door and into a small windowless room lined with metal boxes of various sizes. She used her key in one lock, then instructed me to use mine in the other. With a metallic click, the box unlocked. Margaret pulled it out and set it on a table in the center of the room. I'll give you some privacy, she said, stepping back. Take as much time as you need. Just ring the bell when you're finished. She indicated a small button on the wall before leaving, closing the door behind her. Jake and I stared at the metal box for a moment, neither of us moving. Go ahead, he finally said. Open it. I lifted the lid. Inside were several manila envelopes, neatly labeled in my mother's handwriting. Original adoption papers. Evidence against Linda. Last will and testament. And one simply marked 4. Sai. I reached for the adoption papers first, hands trembling. Inside was a complete set of documents, all bearing official seals and signatures. The adoption had been finalized when I was 6 months old. Everything appeared to be in order. Exactly. As my mother had claimed. These look legitimate to me, Jake said, examining them over my shoulder. Nothing like the forgeries Linda showed you? I set them aside and opened the envelope marked Evidence Against Linda. Inside was a treasure trove of damning information. Emails, recorded conversations, witness statements, all meticulously organized and annotated by my mother. There were records of Linda's attempts to manipulate the adoption paperwork, documentation of her connections to the hospital where the baby swap had occurred, even a signed affidavit from a nurse who had been on duty that night. Your mom was thorough, Jake whispered, his voice filled with awe. She's been building this case for years. I nodded, unable to speak through the lump in my throat. Even as she was dying, my mother had been fighting to protect me. Finally, I opened the envelope marked for Chi. Inside was another letter, shorter than the first. My darling girl, if you're reading this, then you've found the safety deposit. Box and the evidence you need. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you all of this face to face. I wanted to spare you this pain while I was still here to see it in your eyes. There's one more thing you should know. Linda isn't just after the bakery. She's after everything your father and I built together. The business is far more valuable than she's let on. There's a property development company that's been trying to buy the entire block for years, and the bakery is the last holdout. Linda has been in negotiations with them behind my back. The representative's name is Richard Winters. I've included his contact information in this package. Your father's life insurance policy paid out to both of us, to me and to Linda, when he died. She used her portion to invest in that very same development company. She stands to make millions if the bakery is sold and the block is developed. Don't let her win, see. The bakery is your heritage, your future. Fight for it with everything you have. I love you more than words can say. Always, Mom. I handed the letter to Jake, too overwhelmed to speak. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. That explains a lot, he said, his voice tight with anger. This was never about some twisted sense of justice for her niece. It was about money all along. It was about both, I said, finding my voice. She blamed Mom for Sarah's death somehow, and she saw a way to get revenge and get rich at the same time. I shook my head, disgusted. What kind of person does that? The kind who's about to get exactly what she deserves, Jake said grimly. The question is, how do we play this? I thought for a moment, considering our options. We need a lawyer, first of all, someone who can go through all of this and tell us exactly where we stand legally. Agreed. I know someone, Amy Chen. She's tough as nails and specializes in estate disputes. She'll love this case. Good. And we need to contact this Richard Winters, find out what Linda's been telling him. Jake nodded, already pulling out his phone to make notes. What about Linda herself? When do we confront her? I thought about it, remembering my mother's warning. Linda was desperate and dangerous. Confronting her without a solid plan could be risky. Not yet, I decided. We gather our evidence, build our case, make sure we have everything in place. Then we confront her somewhere public, somewhere she can't make a scene or do anything drastic. The charity gala, Jake said suddenly. The one your mom was supposed to attend next week for the children's hospital. Linda's still on the committee, right? She'll be there, along with half the town's elite. It would be the perfect place to expose her. The idea was both terrifying and satisfying. Linda had always been obsessed with her social standing, with how others perceived her. Being publicly exposed would be her worst nightmare. A week gives us time to prepare, I agreed. To make sure we have everything in order legally before we make our move. Jake reached out and took my hand. You don't have to do this alone, CA. I'm with you, every step of the way. I squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for his support. I know, thank you. We spent the next 2 hours going through every document in the box, making copies with the bank's scanner, organizing everything into a coherent narrative. By the time we left, we had a clear picture of what we were dealing with and a solid plan of action. Jake dropped me off a block from the bakery so Linda wouldn't see his car if she happened to be watching. Call me the minute you need anything, he insisted. Day or night. I will, I promised. I'm meeting with Amy Chen at 2. I'll let you know how it goes. Be careful around Linda. Don't let her suspect that you know anything. I won't, I assured him, though the thought of maintaining a facade of ignorance around her made my skin crawl. I'll play the grieving, confused daughter for a little while longer. Back at the house, I found Linda in the kitchen, looking at fabric swatches spread across the counter. She glanced up when I entered, her expression a carefully constructed mask of concern. There you are. I was beginning to worry. I doubted that very much. I needed some air. To think. She nodded, as if she understood completely. Of course, this is a difficult time for you. She gestured to the swatches. I'm thinking of redecorating. The bakery space has so much potential for something more upscale. I bit back a retort, forcing myself to appear merely curious rather than outraged. You're planning to keep it as a business space? Oh, for a while perhaps, until the right opportunity comes along. She fingered a swatch of expensive-looking fabric. Have you made progress on your packing? Some, I said vaguely. It's hard to know what to take and what to leave behind. Linda's smile didn't reach her eyes. Just your personal items, dear. As I said, everything else stays. Right. I moved toward the stairs, then paused, deciding to test her. I was thinking of taking Mom's recipe book, the one she used for the bakery, for sentimental reasons. Linda's expression hardened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing into sympathetic regret. I'm afraid that would be considered a business asset, not a personal item. But I understand why you'd want it. Perhaps we can have copies made of a few recipes for you to keep as mementos. Her condescension made me want to scream, but I simply nodded and continued upstairs. The recipe book was already safely in my backpack, along with the most important documents from the safety deposit box. Let her try to take those from me. My meeting with Amy Chen that afternoon was both reassuring and infuriating. After reviewing the documents, she confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. Linda didn't have a legal leg to stand on. Your adoption was completely legitimate, Amy explained, her voice crisp and professional. The documents Linda showed, you were indeed forgeries, but not in the way she claimed. She altered dates and signatures to make it appear that procedures weren't followed correctly, but the originals you recovered prove otherwise. So, the bakery is mine? And the house? According to your mother's will, yes. Everything was left to you. Linda has no claim whatsoever. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by anger. She knew that. She was bluffing, hoping I'd just believe her and walk away. Unfortunately, that's a common tactic in situations like this, Amy said. Many people don't have the resources or knowledge to challenge such claims, especially when they're grieving. What do we do now? Amy leaned forward, her expression determined. First, we file the will with the probate court immediately. That establishes your claim legally. Then we prepare a cease and desist letter to Linda, demanding that she vacate the premises and return any property she may have removed. Not yet, I said, thinking of our plan for the charity gala. I want to wait a few days before confronting her directly. Amy raised an eyebrow. May I ask why? The sooner we act, the less opportunity she has to cause problems. I explained our plan to expose Linda publicly at the gala to ensure that her reputation was as thoroughly destroyed as her legal claims. Amy listened thoughtfully, then nodded. I understand the appeal, but be careful. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. And make no mistake, once Linda realizes that her scheme has failed, she will be dangerous. I know, I said, remembering my mother's warning. We'll be careful. The next few days were a strange dance of pretense. I continued the charade of packing slowly, while actually removing anything of true importance from the house when Linda wasn't looking. Jake and I met with Richard Winters, the property developer, who was shocked to learn the full story. Ms. Baldwin represented herself as having authority to negotiate on behalf of the estate, he explained, clearly uncomfortable. She provided documentation that appeared to support her claims. Forged documentation, Jake pointed out. Winters shifted in his seat. So it seems. I assure you, our company wants no part of fraudulent dealings. We're prepared to withdraw any offers made under these circumstances. I'm not interested in selling anyway, I told him. The bakery stays in the family. Winters looked disappointed, but not surprised. Your mother said the same thing many times. She was quite attached to the place. You spoke with my mother? This was news to me. Several times over the years, we made various offers, all of which she politely declined. Ms. Baldwin, however, gave us the impression that circumstances had changed, that with your mother's passing, there would be an opportunity to revisit the negotiation. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Linda had been planning this for years, waiting for my mother to die so she could swoop in and claim everything. The day of the charity gala arrived, and with it, a growing sense of inevitability. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, Linda would finally face the consequences of her actions. I spent the morning at Jake's apartment, getting ready. Amy had filed the will with the probate court the day before, establishing my legal claim to the estate. Now all that remained was the public reckoning. Are you sure about this? Jake asked, as he adjusted his tie. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, his usual casual demeanor replaced by something more serious, more determined. I'm sure, I said, smoothing down the front of my dress, a deep blue gown that had been my mother's, altered slightly to fit me. Wearing it felt like having a piece of her with me. Linda took everything from me, my sense of security, my home, nearly my heritage. She needs to understand what that feels like. Jake nodded, though concern still lingered in his eyes. Just stay close to me. If anything feels off, we leave immediately. Agreed. The gala was being held at the Grand Hotel, the most prestigious venue in town. As we entered the ballroom, I was struck by the opulence, crystal chandeliers, elaborate floral arrangements, waiters circulating with trays of champagne. It was exactly the kind of event Linda loved, where she could show off her designer dress and mingle with the town's elite. She was easy to spot, standing near the center of the room in a red gown that must have cost thousands, laughing with a group of admirers. She hadn't seen us yet. There's Richard Winters, Jake murmured, nodding toward a distinguished-looking man near the bar. And the mayor. Good. We want as many influential witnesses as possible. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Let's circulate for a bit. Wait for the right moment. We moved through the crowd, greeting people, accepting condolences for my mother's passing. Many expressed surprise at seeing me there, assuming I had already left town based on what Linda had told them. Oh, CI's moving on to bigger things, I overheard her telling one couple. The bakery was her mother's dream, not hers. She's quite relieved to be free of the responsibility, actually. My blood boiled, but I maintained my composure. Her time was coming. The chairman of the hospital board called for attention, thanking everyone for their generous donations and support. As he spoke, Linda made her way to the front of the room, clearly anticipating being acknowledged for her role on the committee. And now, the chairman concluded, I'd like to invite Linda Baldwin to say a few words about the incredible work being done at our children's wing, a project dear to her heart. This was it, the perfect opportunity. As Linda stepped up to the microphone, I moved forward, Jake close behind me. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, Linda began, her voice warm and sincere sounding. As many of you know, children's causes have always been my passion. Is that why you tried to steal my inheritance? I said loudly, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Out of passion for children. Linda froze, the microphone still in her hand, her eyes widening as she spotted me making my way through the crowd toward her. "Tea," she said, recovering quickly, a forced smile spreading across her face. "What a surprise. I didn't realize you were attending tonight." "Clearly," I said, reaching the front of the room, "or you might have been more careful about what you've been telling people." Murmurs spread through the crowd. I could feel all eyes on us, exactly as planned. "I'm not sure what you mean," Linda said, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold with warning. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "I think we've had enough privacy," I countered. "Enough secrets, enough lies." I turned to face the crowd. "Linda Baldwin has been telling all of you that I've willingly given up my mother's bakery, that I'm moving on to bigger things. What she hasn't told you is that she tried to convince me that my adoption was illegal, that I had no right to my mother's estate." Gasps and whispers rippled through the gathering. Linda's face flushed with anger. "C is understandably upset," she said into the microphone, trying to maintain control. "She's grieving, and grief can make us say things we don't mean." "I have proof," I interrupted, nodding to Jake, who stepped forward with a folder. "Proof that my adoption was completely legal. Proof that Linda forged documents to try to steal my inheritance. Proof that she's been negotiating with developers behind my mother's back for years." The whispers grew louder. Linda's knuckles were white around the microphone. "These are serious accusations," the mayor said, stepping forward with a frown. "Ms. Baldwin has been a respected member of this community for decades." "They're more than accusations," I replied, opening the folder Jake had handed me. "They're facts, documented and verified by legal experts. Linda Baldwin is a fraud and a thief." "How dare you?" Linda hissed, finally losing her carefully maintained composure. "After everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done?" I repeated incredulously. "You mean like trying to rob me of my home and my mother's legacy? Or perhaps you're referring to the way you blamed me, an innocent baby, for the death of your niece." The room went completely silent at that. Linda's face drained of color. "That's right," I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Linda has harbored a grudge against me since I was an infant because of a tragic hospital mix-up that resulted in the death of her brother's biological child. A death that was no one's fault, but that she has spent 25 years trying to avenge." "You don't know what you're talking about," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the microphone carried it to every corner of the room. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. My mother left me a letter explaining everything. She knew what you were planning, Linda. She prepared for it. She made sure I would have all the evidence I needed to expose you." I held up the original adoption papers, the affidavits, the recordings my mother had collected. "It's all here, every detail of your scheme." Linda looked around wildly, seeing the shocked and disgusted faces surrounding her. Her carefully constructed social persona was crumbling before her eyes. "You'll regret this," she snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually, I do," I replied calmly. "I'm dealing with a woman who was willing to use a family tragedy to justify years of manipulation and theft, who was willing to throw an innocent person out on the street to satisfy her own greed." Richard Winters stepped forward, his expression grave. "Is it true that you misrepresented yourself as having authority to negotiate the sale of the bakery property, Miss Baldwin?" Linda's eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to stand here and listen to these accusations." "The police might disagree," Jake said quietly. "Forgery, fraud, attempted theft, those are serious charges." As if on cue, 2 uniformed officers appeared at the ballroom entrance. Linda saw them, and something in her seemed to snap. With a cry of rage, she lunged toward me, her perfectly manicured hands reaching for my throat. Jake moved faster, stepping between us and catching her wrists. The officers rushed forward, quickly taking control of the situation. As they led Linda away, still shouting threats and accusations, the room erupted in confused conversation. The chairman of the board approached me, his expression a mixture of shock and concern. "Ms. Jenkins, I don't know what to say." "If what?" "You're claiming is true." "It is," I assured him, handing over copies of the documentation. "My lawyer can provide you with all the verification you need." The next few hours were a blur of explanations, statements to the police, and countless expressions of sympathy and support from people who had known my mother for years. By the time Jake and I finally left the hotel, it was past midnight, and I was exhausted but exhilarated. "You were amazing in there," Jake said as we walked to his car. "Your mom would have been so proud." The mention of my mother brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I wish she could have seen it. Wish she could know that her plan worked, that I'm safe, that the bakery is safe. Jake put his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "She knew. That's why she went to such lengths to prepare you. She believed in you, see." The following weeks were chaotic but productive. Linda was charged with multiple crimes, including forgery and attempted fraud. She was released on bail pending trial, but her reputation was in tatters. Most of her so-called friends had abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with such a scandal. I moved back into the house above the bakery, reclaiming the space that had always been my home. With Jake's help, I reopened the business, using my mother's recipes and adding a few of my own. The community rallied around us, many people making special trips to show their support. One quiet evening, as we were closing up after a particularly busy day, Jake looked at me across the kitchen counter, his expression thoughtful. "What?" I asked, self-consciously wiping flour from my cheek. "I was just thinking about everything that's happened. About how close you came to losing all of this." He gestured around the bakery. "And about how differently things might have turned out if your mom hadn't been so prepared." I nodded, feeling the familiar mix of grief and gratitude that had become my constant companion. "She saved me. Again. Just like she did when she adopted me." "She gave you the tools, but you were the one who used them," Jake pointed out. "You fought for this place, for your heritage. That took courage." I smiled, touched by his words. "I had help." "Always will," he promised, reaching across the counter to take my hand. "For as long as you want it." There was something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, that made my heart skip a beat. We had been dancing around this moment for weeks now, both of us aware of the shift in our relationship, but hesitant to acknowledge it directly. "Jake," I began, not sure what I was going to say, only knowing that I needed to say something. Before I could continue, the bell above the door chimed, signaling a late customer. We both turned, surprised. We had already flipped the sign to closed. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, hesitant, a small bouquet of flowers in her hands. "I'm sorry. I know you're closed, but I needed to speak with you, Ms. Jenkins." "It's fine," I assured her, though I didn't recognize her. "What can I help you with?" She approached the counter slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. "My name is Margaret Wilson. I was a nurse at Memorial Hospital 25 years ago." She paused, her expression softening. "I was there the night you were born." My breath caught in my throat. "You were part of the baby switch." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Not directly, no. But I was on duty. I saw what happened afterward." She set the flowers on the counter. "I've been following the news about Linda Baldwin. When I heard what she had done, what she had tried to do to you, I knew I had to come forward." Jake moved to stand beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. "What is it you want to tell us, Mrs. Wilson?" "The truth," she said simply. "Something Linda Baldwin has twisted for her own purposes for far too long." She took a deep breath. "The baby switch was a terrible accident, one that haunted everyone involved for years. But what happened to Sarah, Linda's niece, wasn't anyone's fault. It certainly wasn't your fault, or your mother's. Linda seemed to think it was, I said quietly. Margaret shook her head. Linda needed someone to blame. She couldn't accept that sometimes tragic things just happen. Sarah had a congenital heart defect that wasn't detected before she went home. Even if the switch had never occurred, she would have died. I stared at her, stunned by this revelation. Are you sure? Absolutely. It was all in the autopsy report. Linda knew this. I told her myself when she came to the hospital, demanding answers years later, but she refused to believe it. She preferred her version, the one where she had someone specific to blame. My mother, I whispered. And me. Margaret nodded sadly. Your mother was an extraordinary woman. When she found out about the switch, she could have sued the hospital, could have created a terrible scandal. Instead, she focused on loving you, on creating a stable home for you. She never once regretted adopting you, even knowing the circumstances. Tears streamed down my face now, unchecked. Thank you for telling me this, for coming forward. I should have done it years ago, Margaret admitted. But I was afraid of Linda, of what she might do. She had connections at the hospital, and I needed my job. It's not an excuse, but... She trailed off, looking ashamed. It's okay, I assured her. What matters is that you're here now, that the truth is finally out. After Margaret left, Jake and I sat in silence for a long while, processing this new information. Finally, he spoke. So even the foundation of Linda's grudge was based on a lie. Or at least on her refusal to accept the truth, I said, which amounts to the same thing. I shook my head, marveling at the layers of deception and self-deception that had shaped my life without my knowledge. All these years, she blamed my mother, blamed me, for something that was no one's fault. That would have happened regardless. Some people need villains in their story, Jake observed. They can't accept that sometimes life is just random and unfair. I thought about that, about how Linda had constructed an entire narrative around my adoption, casting herself as the righteous avenger, my mother as the villain, and me as... what? The unwitting beneficiary of someone else's tragedy? The living reminder of what had been lost? I don't want to be like that, I decided aloud. I don't want to live my life looking for someone to blame when things go wrong. Jake smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. That's why you're nothing like Linda, and everything like your mom. A week later, as I was sorting through some of my mother's papers, I came across a photo I had never seen before. It showed my mother, much younger, holding a baby, me, and standing next to another woman who looked vaguely familiar. They were both smiling, both looking down at the bundle in my mother's arms with expressions of love. I turned the photo over. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, was a simple note. With Sarah's mother, the day we both chose love over anger. May 12th, 1999. Sarah's mother. The woman who had taken me home from the hospital by mistake, who had lost her own biological daughter as a result of the switch. The woman who, according to this photo and my mother's note, had somehow found a way to move beyond tragedy toward healing. I stared at the image for a long time, wondering about this other mother, this other family that might have been mine in another version of my life. What had become of them? Had they found peace? Had the woman in the photo maintained her commitment to choosing love over anger? Or had she, like Linda, eventually surrendered to bitterness? These were questions I might never have answers to. But as I carefully placed the photo in my keepsake box, I made a promise to myself and to my mother's memory. I would continue to choose love. I would run the bakery with the same generosity and warmth that had made it a community cornerstone under my mother's care. And I would find a way to honor both the mother who had raised me and the biological family I had never known. The next morning, I arrived at the bakery earlier than usual, a plan taking shape in my mind. Jake arrived shortly after, yawning but ready to help with the day's baking. "You're here early," he commented, tying on his apron. "Couldn't sleep?" "I had an idea," I explained, showing him the photo I had found. "I want to rename the bakery." He raised an eyebrow. "Your mom's place has been Eleanor's for 30 years. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said, feeling more certain with each passing moment. "I want to call it Sarah's Sweet Memories." Jake was silent for a moment, taking in the significance of the name. "After Linda's niece? The baby who died?" "Yes, and after my biological mother, whose name was also Sarah, according to the original birth certificate." I took a deep breath. It feels right. A way to honor all the mothers in my story, the one who gave birth to me, the one who raised me, and even the one who lost her child in that tragic mix-up. Jake studied my face, then nodded slowly. "I think it's perfect. A way of bringing everything full circle, of creating something positive out of all the pain." "That's what Mom would have wanted," I said, feeling a sense of peace settle over me for the first time since her death. "She always said the bakery was about creating sweet memories for people. Now it can be about preserving them too." 3 months later, on a bright spring morning, we unveiled the new sign above the bakery door. Sarah's Sweet Memories gleamed in gold letters against a deep blue background, the same blue as the dress I had worn to the charity gala. A small crowd had gathered for the occasion, regular customers, neighbors, friends of my mother's. Even Margaret Wilson was there, standing quietly at the back, her eyes misty with tears. As I cut the ribbon stretched across the doorway, I felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found my way through the dark maze of grief and betrayal to something new and hopeful. The bakery was still my heritage, still my mother's legacy, but now it was also something more, a testament to the power of truth over lies, of love over hatred, of moving forward rather than remaining trapped in the past. "To sweet memories," I said, raising a glass of champagne in a toast. "Past, present, and future." "To sweet memories," the crowd echoed, and as I looked around at their smiling faces, at Jake standing proudly by my side, I knew that my mother had given me the greatest gift of all, not just the bakery, not just the truth about my origins, but the courage to face whatever came next. And whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes and an open heart, just as she had taught me to do. That was her true legacy, and one I would cherish forever.